Child, do you know what silence sounds like? It is not peace, as some believe. It is heavy. It presses against your chest until you cannot breathe. It rattles inside your head until you forget what laughter sounds like. And for me, that silence lasted 15 years. 15 years without my son's voice. But let me tell you how it began. Because stories don't grow from nothing, they grow from wounds. It was a cold night in December. I was sitting in the kitchen, stirring soup that barely filled the pot, when my son, your father, slammed the door behind him. His eyes were hard, his jaw set like stone. He said words that sliced me open. Mom, you've held me back long enough. You have nothing. You are nothing. From today, I don't want you in my life. Therefore, he left, without a second glance. I stood in that kitchen with the spoon trembling in my hand, the soup boiling over, the window rattling from the wind. I wanted to run after him. I wanted to scream, to beg. But my pride held me still. A mother's heart breaks quietly, child. And mine broke that night. Underscore 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 underscore. The days after were filled with emptiness. The chair he used to sit on stayed empty. His laughter, once echoing through the house, was replaced by silence so sharp it hurt my ears. I walked past his room and touched the bed he had left unmade, the posters on the wall, the clothes he hadn't cared to take. Therefore, I began to live like a ghost inside my own home. But you must understand something, I was not a perfect mother. I made mistakes. I was strict. I pushed him to study, to work, to be more than what we were. I had known hunger, child. I had known shame. I had known the sting of neighbors whispering, that poor widow, she'll never make it. I could not bear for him to live the same life. Therefore, I worked myself raw. I scrubbed floors, I washed clothes, I stitched until my fingers bled. I gave him everything I could, even if it meant I had nothing left. But sometimes love, when it is heavy, feels like chains to those who carry none of the weight. He saw only my rules, my sacrifices, my nagging. He did not see the tears I swallowed every night when I thought he was asleep. And so, he walked away. Underscore 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 underscore. The years that followed were the longest of my life. I would sit by the phone, staring at it as if my gaze could force it to ring. Birthdays passed, Christmases passed, Thanksgivings passed, all without his voice. My neighbors would ask, "Mary, have you heard from your boy?" And I would smile weakly, lying, "Oh yes, he's doing fine." But inside, I was dying. Therefore, I poured my love into work. I took jobs no one else wanted. I scrubbed the grease off restaurant floors at midnight. I carried laundry bags bigger than me. I stitched dresses for women who looked at me as though I were invisible. Each dollar I earned felt like a stone, but stone by stone, I was building something. I told myself, one day, Mary. One day, you'll rise from this mud. One day, you'll prove them all wrong. But proving myself meant nothing when my own son wanted no part of me. Underscore 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 underscore. I remember one night especially. It was raining hard, the kind of rain that beats against the windows like fists. I sat alone at the table with a single candle burning. In front of me was a photograph of him, your father, smiling wide, his arms slung around my shoulders. I traced his face with my finger and whispered, "Where are you, son? Why don't you need me anymore?" The candle flickered, and in that flicker, I felt my husband's presence, the man I lost so long ago. I imagined him saying, "Hold on, Mary. Hold on. Life hasn't finished with you yet." Therefore, I held on. But the silence continued. The 15 years dragged across my soul like chains. Underscore 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 underscore. Then, child, one morning, the silence broke. I was older now, my hands wrinkled, my back bent, but I was not broken. I had worked and saved, and slowly, fortune began to turn. My sewing became a small business. My business grew into something larger. And by God's grace, investments I made with trembling hands blossomed like flowers after a long winter. For the first time in my life, I was not poor. For the first time, I could breathe without counting every penny. I had built myself into someone people respected. Therefore, when the phone rang that morning, and I heard his voice after 15 years, I froze. "Mom," he said, his voice strangely soft. "I know it's been a long time. But I heard about your success. I'd love to see you again." But child, do you know what cut me deeper than his silence? It was his timing. He had not wanted me when I was poor, when I was nothing. Now, suddenly, I was someone. And he came back. The grandmother pauses, her eyes glistening, her voice trembling between pain and steel. The child stares, wide-eyed, their little hand clutching hers. That, child, is how betrayal often comes, not as a shout, but as a quiet knock on the door when you least expect it. Therefore, listen closely. Because what happened next was not just a reunion. It was the beginning of something darker, something that would test every ounce of strength I had left. And when it was over, the lesson burned so deep into me that I swore I would never let it fade. Child, when your father called after 15 years, my heart leapt like it hadn't in decades. I wanted to shout, to cry, to run through the streets and tell the world, "My son has come back to me." But then, another voice whispered inside me, "Why now? Why after all this time?" Therefore, I stood between joy and suspicion, like a woman at a crossroad in the dark. Still, I said yes. How could I say no? He was my son. The blood in his veins was mine. The memory of his first cry still rang in my ears. A mother never stops loving, even when her heart has been shattered into pieces. Underscore 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 underscore. The day we met again, I remember every detail. I wore my plain blue dress, the one I had stitched myself, and brushed my silver hair until it shone. I walked slowly into the restaurant where he had asked me to meet. My hands trembled as I pushed open the door. And there he was. My boy, older, broader, but still with the same sharp eyes I had known as a child. He stood and hugged me, and for a moment, I melted. For a moment, I was just a mother again, holding her son. But the hug was quick, almost rehearsed. When he pulled away, his smile did not reach his eyes. Therefore, my heart tightened. Underscore 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 underscore. We sat, and he spoke of many things. He asked about my health, my house, my business. But there was something rehearsed about his questions, like a salesman reading from a list. He did not ask how I survived those 15 years. He did not ask how many nights I had cried for him. He did not apologize. Instead, after a pause, he leaned forward and said, "Mom, I'm glad to see you're doing well. I heard you've built quite a fortune. That's impressive." But it was not admiration in his voice. It was hunger. Therefore, I smiled faintly and nodded, keeping my silence. Because silence, child, reveals more than words. Underscore 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 underscore. He continued meeting me in the weeks after, always at places with fine food and polished walls. He would compliment my perseverance, laugh about old memories, and tell me how much he had missed me. But I noticed the details he avoided. He never spoke of the years he abandoned me. He never asked how I paid the bills, how I kept the roof from caving in. He only asked about numbers. "Mom, how much did you save? How much do you own now? You must need help managing it." Therefore, my suspicion grew like weeds in a garden. Underscore 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 underscore. One night, he invited me to his house. I thought perhaps it was a step toward healing. I hoped to see my grandchildren, to sit at his table like I once had. But when I arrived, the house was shining with luxury. Expensive cars lined the driveway, lights glowed from chandeliers, and people I did not know walked in suits and dresses, holding glasses of wine. It was a party, but not for me. I stood quietly in the corner, watching. He introduced me to some of his friends, but not as his mother. He said only, "This is Mary, a family acquaintance." My heart sank. To deny me as his mother, that was a wound deeper than all the years of silence. But I kept smiling. I kept silent. Because sometimes you must let people show their true colors before you decide how to respond. Underscore 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 underscore. Later that evening, I overheard him speaking to one of his friends. His words sliced through me like knives. "She's got money now. I just need to stay close, and eventually, it'll come my way." Therefore, child, I understood the truth. He had not come back for love. He had come back for wealth. My son, the boy I had raised with broken hands, the boy for whom I had starved myself, looked at me not as his mother, but as a bank. But listen to me, sweetheart. Betrayal does not always shout. Sometimes, it whispers. Sometimes, it smiles across the dinner table. Underscore 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 underscore. That night, I returned home alone. I closed my door, sat in the silence, and cried until my body shook. I cried not just for what he had done, but for the boy I once knew, the boy who had disappeared, swallowed by greed. Therefore, I made a decision. I would not confront him with anger. I would not scream or beg. I had done enough begging in my life. No, this time I would wait. I would watch. I would plan. Because life had taught me one lesson above all others. When people betray you, do not chase them. Do not fight them on their terms. Simply step aside, and let their greed consume them. The grandmother pauses, her eyes glistening, her hands folded in her lap. The child stares at her, wide-eyed, not daring to speak. Child, my story was no longer about loss. It was about justice. Therefore, the time had come to give my son a lesson he would never forget. Child, when I learned the truth about your father's return, my heart broke again. But this time I did not allow myself to be weak. I had been weak for too long, begging for love where there was none. Therefore, I decided to give him exactly what he thought he wanted. Underscore 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 underscore. I began to play my part carefully. I smiled at him during our meetings. I listened as he boasted about his plans, his businesses, his family. I nodded when he spoke of financial troubles. And when he asked if I needed help with my money, I pretended to consider it. But inside, I was building a plan. Therefore, I went to my lawyer, a kind old friend who knew my struggles. Together, we rewrote my will. We arranged everything in secret. My wealth, every last cent, would never fall into greedy hands. Instead, it would go to those who had no one, orphanages, charities, young mothers who reminded me of myself. But for your father, I prepared something else. Underscore 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 underscore. One evening, I invited him to my home, the same small house where you and I sit now. I cooked his favorite meal, just like I used to when he was a boy. The smell of roasted chicken and warm bread filled the air, and for a moment, I almost forgot the bitterness. He ate, laughed, and drank wine, pretending to be the loving son I had always prayed for. But then, after dinner, he leaned forward and said, "Mom, it's time you let me manage things for you. I can take care of everything. You've done enough. Just trust me." His words dripped with sweetness, but his eyes burned with greed. Therefore, I smiled and said softly, "You're right. It's time I hand things over." His face lit up with triumph. He believed he had finally won. But little did he know, child, the papers had already been signed. He would inherit nothing. He would receive only a letter, one that I had written with my own trembling hands. Underscore 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 underscore. The letter said, "My dear son, you left me when I was weakest, and you returned only when I was strong. You taught me that blood is not always thicker than water, and that love without respect is nothing but a shadow. Therefore, I leave you not my money, but my memory. May it remind you of the mother you lost long before I was gone." Underscore 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 underscore. The day I finally gave him that letter, his face turned pale. He shouted, accused, begged, even threatened. But I sat still, calm like a stone by the river. I did not raise my voice. I did not weep. I had already done my weeping years ago. He stormed out of my house that night, and the door slammed so hard the walls shook. That was the last time I saw him. underscore 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 underscore. Now, child, listen closely. I do not tell you this story to fill your heart with anger. No, I tell it to fill your heart with wisdom. Because life will test you. People you love will hurt you. And sometimes, the deepest cuts come from your own family. But remember this, do not let betrayal turn you cruel. Let it make you wise. Therefore, my revenge was not to destroy him, but to deny him. To show him that love cannot be bought, that respect cannot be faked, and that greed always consumes itself in the end. Underscore 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 underscore. And so, here I sit with you, child, in this little house. I have no riches to hand you, no treasures of gold or silver. But I give you something greater, my story. My truth. My lesson. Because wealth fades, but wisdom stays. And the fire of betrayal that once burned me now lights the path for you. Underscore 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 underscore. The grandmother's voice softens. She reaches for the child's hand, her wrinkled fingers trembling, her eyes filled with both sorrow and pride. So, my dear, remember this. When love is real, it needs no wealth. But when greed disguises itself as love, strip it of its mask, and let it die in its own hunger. That, child, was my revenge.